Hello beautiful bluebells, it's lovely to be back with another lesson video, and today's lesson is going to be about adding highlights and shadows to your art. Thank you everyone who voted in the poll this month. It was neck and neck, but in the end, a lesson on lighting was the winner. So I think it'll be nice to chat about some basics, look at a few examples, and then create some illustrations of our own. I'm not an expert on lighting and it's an area I'd like to improve on myself, but I definitely know a thing or two about making simple drawings more lively and more interesting with some basic lighting principles that are really easy to apply. So what do highlights and shadows do for our illustrations? I think they make a flat illustration more lively because they give it some three-dimensionality, because where your highlights and shadows go and what shape or intensity they are can tell us a whole lot about the shape of what we're looking at. They can also introduce a broader range of tonal contrast into our illustrations, which is the range of light to dark we have, and that also helps things feel less flat. Tonal contrast helps separate elements of our art and draw the eye to areas of importance, and generally having a bigger range of contrast is good to have. Lighting also livens up our art because it can tell us about the mood and atmosphere, and is another great tool artists have to use if they want to. It can make things feel bright and happy, or cozy, or spooky. There are lots of ways to use light to impact the mood of your illustrations. I think it's fine to keep lighting simple, especially if you're a beginner or if that's just your style. But as you get more practice, it's nice to play with highlights and shadows and see if you like it. So let's take a look at some real-world examples of light to improve our basic understanding of how light behaves so that we can apply it to our drawings. Harsh light will create sharp shadows, diffused light will create soft shadows. So when the sun is shining brightly and is the main source of light, we get strong, sharp shadows, and the direction and length of the shadows will be based on where the light source is. Because the sun is shining at the top right of this frame, the dog's shadow is cast to the bottom left and is strong because the sun is so bright. I think this is quite a fun type of shadow to draw because it's so direct and predictable. It's nice to use in bigger scenes and can create some really dramatic and interesting shapes in your drawing. When there's a single light source but it's diffused, like on a cloudy day, then you get really soft shadows. These are far less defined because the light source is less defined. I think these shadows are quite easy to draw, but are less dramatic, and I use them a lot. You can get away with being really general and loose with them because they're so soft, but they still give some three-dimensionality to your drawing. Then there are shadows that are more complicated, like when there are multiple light sources. Inside scenes are often like this because you might have lights on inside and light coming through the window and light reflecting from surfaces. So I won't go into those in this video because I don't draw shadows like that and don't need to for my style. But if you're trying to be really realistic, then maybe it's something to be aware of. Another thing to note about shadows is that they are darker the closer to the object they are, and the closer that object is to another surface. It depends on how harsh your lighting is, but if you have a pen, for example, the shadow is probably going to be the strongest directly beneath the pen and then soften as it gets a little further away. As well as the cast shadows, we can consider the highlights and shadows on an object itself. These as well depend on how strong the light source is and where it is. Generally, the brightest highlights will be on edges that face the light source and are close to it, and shadows will be on any edges that directly face away from the light source. For round objects, of course, this isn't a hard line, but will be a gradient of dark tones to midtones to highlights. As for what color shadows are, that depends on the color of the lighting and the color of the objects in the scene. Shadows are rarely black or grey, and there's no one-size-fits-all color, but often artists choose dark greens, blues, or purples for shadows. It's common for shadows to be a cooler version of the object that shadow is on, meaning more toward blue. For the sake of simplicity, I usually make the shadows in my illustrations a darker and more vibrant version of the object's color, but really if I want it to be a bit more accurate, I should also make them a cooler version of the color of that object. So let's apply these principles to some really simple examples, and then after that I'll show you how I apply shadows and highlights to an illustration. First, let's take a textbook approach to understanding how to draw cast shadows, the ones that are cast by an object onto another surface rather than the ones on the object itself. Realistically, I normally just eyeball this and don't ever measure it out or really care if it's too accurate, but it's good to know how to do it and that the technique exists for when you want your shadows to look real or you're just not sure where to begin. So I've drawn a party hat and a horizon line behind it. Let's add a nice happy sunshine as our light source in the top left as if it's kind of in the distance. Now to figure out how long the shadow should be for the object, there's quite a simple technique. You want to draw a line directly down from the light source to the horizon line. Now draw a line from the base of that line straight through the middle of our cone. If we had a box or a shape with multiple points, we'd need to put a line through all of the exterior corners. Now draw a line from the light source through any corners of the object, which for us is this top point here. It's sort of the top point of the hat. Where your lines intersect is where the edges of the shadow are, so we can see our two lines intersect here, which means that's where our shadow ends. Now we can just fill in from that point down to the edges of our object, which for us are these two sides of the cone, and color in the shadow between all of those lines. So now we have this stretched triangular shadow, and I also know there's a bobbly shape on top, so I'll add that onto the shadow and we'll just roughly add that shape stretched out onto our shadow. I don't actually measure my shadows like this very much when I draw, but it's really handy to know about. So let's draw something that I do draw a lot as an example of how I would do some really basic lighting. I've drawn this simple leaf shape and it's got a little bit of texture on it already and a few details, but it could really use some more life. So I'll take the base color of the object, I'll make it a little more blue for this example, and I'll make it less saturated only because of how I'm going to use the layer. I'm making a new layer above the leaf. It's a clipping mask, so it'll stick to the shape of the leaf, which we went over in a previous video. And I'll set it to multiply blend mode, which means the colors will multiply together and we'll end up with a richer, more vibrant version of the color I picked. That's why I made it less saturated when I picked the color, because if I don't, it'll end up really dark and a bit too rich. So the first layer of shadow I'm going to do on this one is some smaller, sharp shadows, and I'm going to say that my light source is on the left. Because leaves usually have grooves down the middle, I'll add a line of shadow down one side of the middle where it would be facing away from the light source a little as it heads down into that groove. I'll also add some shadow over on the right edge of the leaf and down the little stem as well. I pretty much always have my brush set to variable opacity when I do shadows, so that the opacity changes based on how much pen pressure I use, so that way the ends of my shadow naturally fade out with my pen strokes. I'll make a new layer above now, make it a clipping mask again, and also set it to multiply. But this time reduce the opacity of the whole layer a bit so that this shadow isn't as strong. I've made my brush broader and reduced the amount of texture coming through so that the edges are soft and will give us gentle shading. If you're in Procreate or another program, you can do all of these same things, and you can also just choose a brush that's softer. So I'll focus this shading down the left of the middle of my leaf and around the right edge. It just gives it a bit more shape and brings it to life a little more. For highlights, I'll do a similar process. I think I'll just add one layer of highlight though, and this layer won't have a blend mode, it'll be normal. I'll choose the base color of the object, make it lighter without losing too much saturation, and perhaps make it a bit warmer as well, so taking it toward red on the color wheel. I'll just add some really simple highlights to the left edge, closest to the light source, and down to the bottom of my stem. So this is a stylized way of doing highlights and shadows that I use in my style. It's not necessarily the most realistic, but that's not what I'm going for, so that's okay. For a cast shadow for something like this, I'd honestly just make my best guess as to where it should go, which art teachers wouldn't be happy with, but you could absolutely use the technique I showed you before if you prefer. Since we're drawing this shadow on white, I've chosen quite a blue-green, making it fairly dark and fairly grey, and making sure my brush is on variable opacity. I'll focus a little around the base as if the leaf is in the ground and loosely replicate and stretch the shape of the leaf until it goes off the artboard. Now I'll make sure the shadow is strongest at the base of the leaf and then fades out. And I might also change the opacity of the whole layer until I'm happy with how that looks. So that's my simplified lighting process. I start with the base shape. I add some fine, sharp shadows to define edges. I add some broader, softer shading across the shape, focusing on areas that would have less light. I add some highlights around edges that are facing the light source. And then I'll add a cast shadow if it's needed. And that's it. Now I thought it would be fun to take a simple scene and do the shadows and highlights with you. This drawing I actually did post to Instagram a little while ago, so let's recreate the shading together. And this is accurate to my normal process, where I'll do a sketch of what I want to draw, lock in all the base colors, maybe add the details next, or sometimes I do it after the shading, and then add lots of shading and highlights. So let's do that now. I've got my illustration set up with every major element that's in a different color on its own layer. Any textures or shading for that shape will go in its own layer above the shape and set as a clipping mask to it. I've already got some texture and details since we're just focusing on the shading today, and I've already got the shading on the cats, so we'll just do the pot and the plants to save time. Now I want the leaves to feel separate to one another because at the moment they all kind of blend together. So let's give them shading in between where they meet because there'd be less light there. The light source in this illustration is quite soft and generally in the top left again. So on a new layer above the leaf I'm shading, I've got a broad brush on variable opacity. I've got the base green but a little cooler and more grey. And I've set the layer to multiply. I'm going to focus on adding the shading directly behind the front leaf to give some separation and also because it would be darker here. I'm also going to take some of this shading down the stem so that the plant is darker at the bottom and has a nice gradient from base to tip. I'll do the same thing on the set of leaves in the back, focusing where any leaves overlap and then down the stem. Any leaves that aren't overlapping any others, I'll just add a bit of shading to the base of the leaf, mostly on the right, just to give them a little bit of extra depth as well. Now that there's a base pass on the leaf shadows, I'll do a similar thing again, but more defined and focused this time. So this time my brush is a bit finer and the color I've selected is a bit stronger. I'm doing the same thing, but also going around some of the leaf edges to suggest the sides of the leaf. For some simple highlights, I'll take the base green of the leaf, lighten it and make it a bit warmer, and then just lightly go over the edges of the leaves facing the light source. This is just subtle because our light source isn't very strong, it just helps add some more tonal variation to our leaves. Now let's add some shading to the pot. I'll start with shading underneath the lip of the pot, and because our light source is to the top left, the shadow will fall mostly in the opposite direction to the bottom right. I'll do another softer layer that focuses totally on the right side because the pot is round, so it'll have a gradient of shadow getting stronger to the right. So when shading shapes like this, I just need to think about what surfaces are facing away from the light source. One of them is the inside of the pot, and a really easy way to make a pot shape feel more realistic is to shade the inside wall darker. Now we want to leave the rim lighter because it's a different surface and has more light on it. I'll just add a little more shading to the right side of this top rim here, and then I'd say that's a nice simple pass of the shading all sorted for this pot. If we like, we can also add a soft highlight around the left rim of the pot. So that's how I take the base level of my illustrations and liven them up with some really quite simple lighting. I personally don't stress too much about being super realistic with my lighting, at least not at this point in my art style. I just try to generally shade things as they would be using the basic principles we've talked about in this video. So to recap on what we learned in this video, harsh light will create sharp shadows, diffused light will create soft shadows. The direction your shadows travel in will be opposite to the direction your light source is. Shadows are usually stronger the closer they are to the object casting the shadow. Shadows aren't really just black or grey, they're often a cool colour. Highlights will be on the sides of your shapes that are facing the light source or edges that are closest to your light. And highlights aren't usually white, they're normally a light, vibrant version of the object's colour with a little more warmth. And that's how I do highlights and shadows in my art in my current style. I think lighting can be really so helpful in leveling up beginner art that is maybe a little flat, so I hope you found this lesson helpful for your own illustrations if you've been struggling with highlights and shadows, and of course please let me know if you have any questions at all. See you in the next video. Bye bye!